Good old Vizzini. He has an elevated opinion of his own understanding of things, right? For him, for Vizzini, things are always this way and not that way. And the possibility of things turning out somehow different are, as he said, absolutely, totally, and in every other way, inconceivable. Well, I think it's hard to be hard on him because that kind of confidence is kind of vaguely familiar. It's pretty easy to go through our days just seeing things like we always see them, looking at things like we always have, expecting what we always expect. But, of course, there is the fact that things are not always what they seem to be. And sometimes, maybe sometimes, the surprises we get are actually happy ones. People throughout history have been thinking about that, and they've written and talked about this idea. Philosophers and theologians, and scientists and economists, teenage bloggers, the people that write the fortune cookies, they all have a take on things are not always what they seem to be. So today, I wanted to tell a few stories that remind us that there are plenty of good surprises in the world. And I really hope that by doing this, by rehearsing a few good surprises, we'll be able to gain a little courage to face the obvious difficulties of our lives together. You know what? Our brains really like positive things. And every time something pleasant happens, our brain produces dopamine. And that's been called the pleasure chemical. And it's not just pleasure for pleasure's sake, however good that is. It's a pleasure that opens us up to investigation, that makes us more curious, that gives our brains the pathway, the open pathway to learn something and therefore be motivated so we can do that pleasurable thing that we want to do or need to do. And the production of dopamine is actually accelerated when something good happens that we were not expecting. So when we have a good surprise, the dopamine spikes. So today, I just want to tell you a few stories. These stories go in different directions, but maybe we can think of it as sort of an exercise in flexing our minds so that we can begin to look for the inconceivable and be encouraged. And remember, just because you're looking for something that is surprising doesn't mean you won't still be surprised when you find it. Exhibit 1. I read this great story last week about a woman who got to the airport early enough that she was going to have some time to sit and read her book. So that's good news. So she's walking through the airport and she passes by one of the little stores and decides to go in and get some cookies. So she finds what she wants, and okay, now she goes out to the gate and she finds a seat to sit down, and she's arranging her carry-on bag and, making sure there's the boarding pass on top like we always do. She's leaning over to find the book that she wants to read, getting her glasses, and suddenly she realizes that the young man sitting in the seat just on the other side of the empty seat beside her has grabbed up the cookies, ripped them open, and begins to eat one. Well, she is a little surprised, but she doesn't actually want to say anything about it or make a big deal. So she just very quietly reaches over and also gets a cookie, decides to settle into her book. Well, in a minute, the young man takes another cookie. Well, this is a little bit appalling and a little aggravating, and so she sits there thinking about that and just how rude the guy is, but of course, she doesn't want to miss out on the cookie, so she reaches over, also takes another cookie. Now, this little thing just keeps on going back and forth. Now there's a little bit of restrained passive aggressiveness going on, each person taking a cookie and then another, and finally, there's only one left. That's when their eyes meet. The young man, holding her gaze, grabs the other cookie, breaks it, gives her half of it, and she can't believe it. They sit staring straight ahead, chomping. Finally, the flight attendant calls. It's time to get on the plane. She grabs her bag, gets down the jetway, settles herself into her seat, reaches back down to get the book to read, and lo and behold, there is an unopened package of cookies in her bag. Things are not always what they seem. Okay, sorry, I gotta adjust here. I'm getting kind of hung up here. Exhibit 2. Wangari Maathai was a Kenyan woman who certainly pushed back the boundaries of what would seem conceivable for women in her time and place. African nations, like our own nation, have so much work to do about humanitarian rights, about environmentalism, about governments with integrity, and all of these were issues that Wangari Maathai took on. She worked tirelessly and fearlessly for democracy. She worked for peaceful governmental change, being involved in a whole bunch of rallies and protests, but she was outspoken. She was outspoken against the government because she believed that it was the government's corruption that was leading to poverty in her nation. She worked for the rights and the empowerment of women. She served on a number of committees working for that cause, and she planted trees. Trees. She was the first woman in East Africa to ever earn her PhD, and she earned it in the area of science and biology. And because she knew that the preservation of the environment is critical to survival, she founded the Green Belt movement. It was a grassroots organization whose purpose was to empower women. So she and women all over the nation planted little saplings. She taught them how to do it and how to care for the nursery as they responded to the deforestation and erosion that was occurring everywhere. Now, we all know that trees are really important to the environment for a lot of reasons, but in rural Africa, in little farms and villages, far away from the seats of power, where the money is, trees are vital because there's no electricity out in the rural areas. And so trees mean firewood. Firewood means cooking. Cooking means survival. Her work saved so many little villages from extinction. Wangari won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004 for her work on the environment and on democracy and peace. Her life and her work were a surprise, emerging as it did from a myriad of problems and improbabilities. She went around the world giving all kinds of speeches because she was famous like that for everything she had done. And she often told this little story, and I've already told the kids that they're going to get to hear this story. She told this story from place to place, and I so wish that I had that lovely African English lilt to my voice, but you can go on YouTube and hear her tell it. But it goes like this. I want to tell you a story because it is a story of never give up. It's a story of a forest that went on fire, a huge forest that was suddenly on fire. It was a raging fire. All the animals came out of the forest, and as they came to the edge of the forest, they started watching the fire, feeling very discouraged and very disempowered. Every one of them did not think there was anything that they could do about the fire except a little hummingbird. The little hummingbird said, I can do something about this fire. I will not stand on the side and watch the forest burn. So the little hummingbird flew toward the nearest stream. She took a drop of water and flew back to the fire. Back and forth she went with a drop of water every trip. And while she was doing that, the other animals were discouraging her. They were saying, don't bother. It's too much. You're too little. Your wings will burn. Now, some of these animals that were doing the discouraging actually had big beaks, and they could have taken more water to the fire than the little hummingbird ever could. But they weren't. They were busy discouraging. But the hummingbird decided not to be discouraged. It kept going back and forth, putting drops of water on the burning forest. And the animals that were discouraging it, and as the animals were discouraging it, without wasting her time, she looked back and saw how discouraged they look and how persuaded they were to stay and do nothing. One of the animals said, what do you think you are doing? And she looked back again without wasting time and said, I am doing the best I can. Wangari Maathai, telling great stories all over Africa. Exhibit 3. Lawrence Anthony was known as the elephant whisperer. He was a conservationist who worked to save wild animals from extinction by reason of war and other conflicts between animals and people. Anthony died of a heart attack at age 61. His wife reported on Facebook that for 2 days after his death, 2 separate herds of elephants arrived at the main house and stood there at the compound, just stood there, gathering as they do when one of their own herd dies. The woman said she and her husband hadn't seen these animals at the main house for a long time. And she said it was an extraordinary proof that animals have this sensitivity and awareness that only a few people perceive. We live in a surprising world. Now, those of you who have pets, you have your own stories. You know about this knowing that exists between animals and people. It's fascinating, and we don't understand it all. Well, I could just go on and on telling great stories that point up surprises and unexpected endings. But Aaron Brockovich, with no legal training at all and very little education in the first place, helped to build a case against the giant Pacific Gas and Electric Company in Northern California because that company was responsible for the contamination of water in their town. Then there was Seabiscuit, a small, weak horse with an inauspicious beginning, who became a thoroughbred champion in the U.S. during the dark days that followed the Depression in the 1920s and 30s. I was in New Orleans in the summer after Katrina hit. I was leading a group of teenagers to gut houses. We were taking them down to the studs so that someone could come back in and build them again and the people could go back home. We were driving around one afternoon in one of those church passenger vans, and may I never have to drive another one. We're driving around, and suddenly I said, we've got to stop. Why are we stopping? There's this area, the sidewalk is all buckled up. It looks pretty much like a war zone, as many places in New Orleans did at that time. There was a wildflower blooming courageously in the crack in the sidewalk. You've seen those too. There are all kinds of surprises. There are UFOs that turn out to be Chinese lanterns, and we wonder how in the world we could have been so mistaken. There's the person we have a hard time warming up to, and it turns out they really have a high regard for us. There's the student who seems awful lazy, but in fact, maybe she came to school hungry. Jesus told great stories that invited us to see the unseen, to rethink our thinking. My favorite one is one of those parables that Dave read today about the farmer who was doing what farmers do, throwing out seed. And the text says really beautifully, I think, that whether the farmer slept or waked, all by itself, the seed grew and produced a crop. Since that story emerged in first century Palestine, we can figure they didn't know very much about how plants grow. And so maybe Jesus was using their lack of information to bring out the surprise and the mystery of things that we don't understand. And he said the kingdom of heaven's like that too. Well, we know an awful lot about how plants grow and the sun and the biology, and you can tell by the way I'm describing it, I don't know much, but we know about that stuff. But even still, we have the deep questions about the creation and the creator and our relationship to the whole thing. And so we too are arrested by these words that speak to us of mystery, of things that carry on without our knowledge. This is good news. In the church, we happen to call this the gospel. Well, the Bible is really full of a lot of stories that suggest that things are not what they seem, and that the world is full of surprises. For instance, think about the Bible story of 3 generations of women who were unable to bear children. And we heard about the first one a few weeks ago when Linda McDermott was teaching, and that was Sarah. She's like 90 years old. She's unable to have a baby, and an angel comes to her and says, "You're going to have a baby." Well, the text is kind of comical right here because Sarah goes, "Am I to have this pleasure at this age in life?" In the Hebrew, it says, "Things are not what they seem." And then there's the crazy story about the young man who killed an evil giant with his slingshot. And there's another story, little known story, about a donkey who twists his head around and says to his master, "Stop beating me." It's in there. strange stories that tell us we don't know everything, that there's imagination for us to take hold of. And I'm going to ask the band to come up and join me now because they're going to help me make this very last point. The Bible, our lives, the whole world is completely full of amazement and surprise, and I'm so grateful to you, Tom, for saying that indeed the world is troubled. There are many things that we just weep over, and yet we must also keep awake to the wonder and good so that we have strength to carry on. Possibly the most well-known theme in the Bible is the one that keeps us surprised all the time, and it is the theme of resurrection. The central story of the Christian faith says that things are not sealed behind closed big stones, that new starts are possible, that there is life after death. And whether we believe that means new life now, or when things get broken here, we can start again, or whether we think it means life beyond the grave, or whether we think it means both. Either way, these stories of resurrection, of new beginning, have motivated us and others for all of time to take heart, to find courage, to embrace the good, and to go around feeling good.